Well, I'm unable to sleep, and it's like 6 o'clock in the morning, so I'm going to tell you all a story. This story is about my dad again, except it's when he was a little boy, long before I was born. My dad was born in 1937, so, he was alive during the war and all that, born in the Depression, lived through the war as a little boy. He told me one time that he remembers hearing Hitler on the radio, because on the news they used to play clips of speeches that Hitler had made, just to show how kind of what a madman he was. I guess you could hear it in his voice. It was in German, but you could tell he was kind of crazy. So my dad, he remembered listening to that on the radio when he was a little boy, and he remembered the last day of the war, when I guess when it come to an end finally in 1945. He was 8 years old at the time, and I think he was eight. Yeah, well, yeah, I guess he was. I think that's what he told me, is that he was eight. Anyway, I'd have to do some math. But anyway, 37 to 45. If you're curious, you figure it out. He was in the 8-year-old range anyway, if he wasn't eight. Anyway, it ended up that he remembers the last day. He remembers people dancing on the streets in our hometown and all that. He remembers all of that. After the war, near to where my dad grew up, where my grandparents lived, even when I was a kid and a young man, my grandparents still lived there. Near to there was our local airport. We were just in a small town with a population of 6,000 people, but like a lot of little towns years ago, we had an airport, just for light planes. That was still there until around 1982. I remember that airport. I was out there a few times. My dad used to take me out there to watch the planes taking off and landing, and to look at the planes and stuff when I was just a little boy. He used to take me out there. Anyway, what had happened was, though, after the war, there were a lot of men come home, and they were kind of at a loose end. They didn't have anything to do. And the government offered help to veterans in the form of loans and grants and educational opportunities and all that. And so a lot of guys started little businesses. And there were these two men that my dad ended up befriending, because my dad had a fascination with airplanes. When he was a little boy, he loved airplanes, and that's what he wanted to do when he grew up. He wanted to be a pilot. And my dad used to go up to the airport and look at the planes and talk to the guys that flew them and all that stuff, when he was a little boy, because the airport was like a couple of blocks away from the house. And he met these two guys after the war, these two pilots. They had been pilots in the war, and what they had done is they had bought an old World War II airplane, basically a government surplus airplane, and they had started a courier service, which was really quite something in the 1940s. It was kind of a revolutionary idea. And if you needed something flown into Ottawa or into Kingston or wherever, any of the places around here, if you needed something flown there in a hurry, or you needed to get there in a hurry, they'd take you. You get on their plane and they'd take you. If you needed to be in Ottawa in 20 minutes, well, it would take you an hour to get there, at least by car. If you needed to be there in 15 or 20 minutes, you could get on their plane and they'd take you. And if you needed a parcel delivered, they'd take that too. And so my dad met these guys, and he befriended them. They showed him the inside of the aircraft. They showed him the controls and everything, kind of taught him a little bit about how it worked. And they told him he was too young to learn to fly at his age. This was like in 1946, 1947 in there. But they told him when he got a little older, if he was interested, they'd take him up in it and they'd teach him how to fly it. So, of course, you can imagine my dad as a little boy having this fascination with airplanes that he had. That was a big deal. So he got that he knew their schedule. And every time they'd be coming in, he'd just run down to the airport anyway to see them, you know. And those were his friends. And, like most kids of his age, he really looked up to the guys that had fought in the war, and the Air Force guys especially, because he had this interest in planes and stuff like that. And the Air Force guys were known they were I don't know, they got more respect even than the regular Army guys got in society back then. And they were considered to have pretty much won the war, And so that's just how people would think, about it. And I don't know, anyway, he had a lot of respect for them, and he really liked them, and they were kind of heroes to him. And they were making these regular flights in and out of the town anyway, delivering things and picking people up and all that business. And one day in 1947, when my dad was 10 years old, there was an awful crash. Everybody around there heard it, and they knew something bad had happened. Now, where the crash happened, it's now where our town holds its fair every year, its fall fair. I'm not sure if the town held the fair at that location at that time, but maybe they did. I don't know. I couldn't tell you. It was 1947, and I'm not sure, but there was a crash up there, and that was only like a block away from the house, from where my dad grew up. And my dad and my grandpa both heard it, and so them, along with everybody else, ran to the place. I'll call it the fairgrounds because that's what it is now, and that's what it has been all my life. I don't know if that's what it was back then, like I said, but I'm going to call that property the fairgrounds, just make it easier to tell the story. Even though I don't know for certain that that's what it was at the time. My dad and my grandpa, they run up there. Now, my grandpa, he was an electrician, and he actually worked for the town. He was part of the town crew, basically. He was an electrician. He kept the lights on the streets and anything like that needed to be done in the town. That's what he did. And so that's going to factor into the story in a minute. My grandpa, anyway, he was an electrician. Him and my dad, they run up to the fairgrounds, and what had happened was the plane that belonged to my dad's friends, as they were getting low to approach the airport, they had caught some overhead power lines. They had caught some high-tension wires that ran through there. And, of course, that brought the plane down, and it brought the wires down, too. And apparently it had been raining, so the ground was wet, and there was fog and everything. The visibility wasn't good. They'd hit these wires, and they brought the plane down. The wires had come down, and they were still live, and the wires were writhing around on the ground like snakes. They were actually moving like snakes because they were full. Their electricity was still flowing through them. And my grandpa, he yelled at the guys. He said, "Stay inside the plane. Don't get out of the plane." And he said, "I'm an electrician. I'm going to go home and I'm going to call the town and tell them to cut the power to these lines. But don't get out of the plane because you'll be electrocuted if you do." Well, one of the guys was in a panic, and he actually did get out of the plane. And as soon as he hit the ground, he was cooked, basically. He was electrocuted. Dropped dead right there when his feet hit the ground. The other guy was trapped in the plane. He was trapped by his harness and he couldn't get out. And I mean, that actually temporarily saved his life because, of course, if he had gotten out, he'd have been electrocuted too. Well, my grandpa had gone back to the house to call the town to get them to cut the power to those lines. And by the time my grandpa got back to the crash site, the power had been cut, the lines had stopped driving around like snakes, but a fire had started in the back of the plane, and it was steadily moving up the body of the plane, and of course the pilot, who was still alive but trapped by his harness, he was in there. Well, one of the men that had run up there to see what had happened, he had a knife, and so he run out there and he started trying to cut the harness to get the pilot out. And he sawed away on that harness anyway, and he partially cut through it, but not enough to get the guy out. And the flames were reaching him, and they basically drove him back, and he couldn't stay there. So he had to get away from it. And nobody could help that fella anyway. He ended up being burned alive in the plane. And the story I heard is that you could hear him in there crying and calling for his mother, and it was pretty awful. And these were the two guys that were friends of my dad, the two Air Force veterans that had bought this plane and started this courier service. And that affected my dad, I know, pretty deeply. He never talked about it, really. I heard the story from other people. My dad had never talked about it. But my dad and my grandpa both couldn't stand the smell of roast beef cooking. If either one of them walked into a house where somebody had a roast of beef on, they'd puke. And in fact, in that era, they lived pretty much on roast beef. And when they came home after this accident, my grandma was making beef stew, and they walked into the house, and they took one breath of that beef stew. They got one sniff of that, and the two of them went outside and puked. And the reason for that was that guy burning, the smell, I guess, was a lot like the smell of beef cooking. And my dad always had that association with the smell of beef cooking and that incident. And he'd be sick to his stomach if he smelled beef cooking. He couldn't stand it. And like I say, my grandpa was the same way for the rest of his life, too. Anyway, that's the story. That's one of the stories. One of the things that my dad experienced when he was young. There was another incident after that I'm not going to talk about too much, but it involves a couple of Catholic priests, so you can imagine. Went from when he was 12 years old. And, these things left their marks on him. And these things affected people in different ways. People that he knew after that. They affected all of his children. I'm not his only child. I have several half-sisters and one sister who's, I guess you could say, a full sister, because we have the same mom and dad, as opposed to just having the same dad, like my other sisters. There was one brother, too, but he only lived a day and he died. That was in the early 60s. I was born in 68. So I never knew anything about him until later on. I knew about him when I was a kid, because I was told about him when I was probably 6 or 7 years old, but I didn't know about him otherwise. I wasn't alive when he was born, and he only lived a very short time. So I just lived a day, basically. And so, like I say, when you know these things about people, then you can kind of understand them better. And that's one of the reasons that I've always said, when you see somebody who isn't acting right or by your standard, or somebody who doesn't do things the way you think they should, or somebody who just maybe acts like a real piece of you-know-what in your estimation, you got to always bear in mind that you don't know that person's story. You don't know why they are the way they are. That doesn't mean you have to tolerate being disrespected or being abused. You shouldn't, and you don't. And you may have to cut some people off. I've had to do that. But, it's good to always be understanding of the fact that everybody's carrying their own stuff, and we don't always know what that stuff is. And so if you see somebody who you don't understand them, you think they're kind of an odd duck or whatever, at least don't be cruel to them because of it. Don't make fun of people. Don't target people for abuse because they're not acting just the way that you figure they should. And see, I learned that over the years. And I've been the odd duck myself. I've been the guy that's been picked on because I didn't act the way people thought I should. So I understand from that. I can see it from that side. But again, a lot of people don't know my story, so I can't expect them to understand. But I also it would have meant a lot to me if they hadn't have done that. And the people who didn't do that, the people who were kind to me, they meant a lot to me. So, be somebody who means a lot to an odd duck, if you can be, as opposed to somebody who just adds to their trauma. That's what it boils down to. Anyway, I've told the story. It's never story from, like I say, from my dad's childhood, not from mine. Although it had its effect on me, like anything will. That anything your parents go through will affect you one way or another. So that's the story. I hope I won't say enjoyed it so much because it's a sad story, but I hope that it was of some value to y'all. It's an interesting story. I find it interesting to think that happened in my hometown and that my dad was affected by it like he was. Anyway, that's it. Talk later.